Okay, guys. So yesterday in class, we started to take a look at two really important conflicts during the Cold War, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And the argument that we're trying to advance or explore is that the Cold War wasn't just this weird 50-year balance between us and the Soviets where we were both afraid to use nuclear weapons on each other for fear that the other side would retaliate. There actually was very real fighting and very real dying that took place, especially in Asia and then later in Africa, between the ideals of the Soviets and the spreading of Marxist communism and the ideas of the Americans and the rest of the West, which we claimed was democracy and capitalism. So yesterday we looked at Korea. We explored the ideas that the Koreans gave up some of their autonomy, were embarrassed when they were invaded and taken over by the Koreans in the early 1900s, or excuse me, taken over by the Japanese in the early 1900s. And from there, the split that resulted in Korea with us supporting the South and both the Chinese and the Soviets supporting the North was a good manifestation to see the stark contrast between us and the communists. And of course, that war is still technically carrying on today, as you saw with the demilitarization zone and the tense relationship that those two countries have with each other. So today we're going to turn our attention to a conflict that started right about as the conflict in Korea started to cool off, and that's the one in Vietnam. So Vietnam and their experience in the early 20th century was very similar to Korea's. So the Vietnamese were part of the French colony of Indochina for about the past 100 years. And in the early 1900s, there was a big push for them to get some autonomy. This guy here, Ho Chi Minh, is somebody that we looked at earlier this year. He showed up at the Paris Peace Conference to talk to Woodrow Wilson about getting some self-determination for him and his people. And as we studied, Woodrow Wilson basically dismissed his claims, claiming that, Asians were not eligible for the same type of rights and freedoms as other Western groups. So in Ho Chi Minh and others, there was a boiling sense of bigotry and racism and all of these things that eventually came to the head in the 1950s. So after Ho Chi Minh and his followers were able to expel the French in the 1950s, they gut them out. They ended up in a conflict with the South. So the South was led by this guy, Ngo Dinh Diem, and he was a really complicated character. He was a Roman Catholic, which was, a carryover of Western imperialism. He agreed with and often aligned himself with Western powers. He negotiated with all these groups, and Ho Chi Minh and his followers thought that he was kind of a traitor, somebody who would switch sides and gone to the West. So the United States became involved in the late 1950s in an effort to continue the containment policy, to keep communism where it was and not to let it spread. So we supported Ngo Dinh Diem. This got really complicated when JFK became president because, of course, he too was a Roman Catholic, and a lot of people were critical of their decision to align themselves with each other. But the war itself really started after JFK was killed. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution was a moment in history when an American ship essentially was blown up in the Tonkin Gulf area. And the U.S. government claimed that it was an attack by the Vietnamese, specifically the Viet Cong. And they said that it was justification to go to war. So President LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, he's the guy who took over for JFK. He went before Congress and asked for them to give him war powers, which would allow him to essentially act as a war leader and try to start a conflict with the Vietnamese. So in other words, Congress did not technically declare war in this case. They basically gave the president blank authority to act on his own accord and try to bring in a conflict that the country would be involved in for the next 2 decades. So the war actually spanned 4 presidencies. The Viet Cong, like the North Koreans and the Chinese, used guerrilla tactics to overwhelm the United States. We wanted to fight a conventional warfare. Nixon eventually called for Vietnamization, which means the United States would pull out and give control back to the South Vietnamese. And that, of course, allowed the Viet Cong and Ho Chi Minh to come in and basically take over the whole country. So communism took over Vietnam completely, and also neighboring Cambodia. And Cambodia was probably the darkest chapter of this whole war in terms of natives, because the Khmer Rouge was a group of communists that took over and carried out a massive genocide that I'll explain to you in just a minute. All right, so let me just give you a quick breakdown. If you want to, I'll share these videos with you. This is the video of LBJ going before Congress and the American people and explaining what happened at the Gulf of Tonkin. This is the video of George W. Bush speaking to the American people after the attacks on 9/11. There's a lot of interesting parallels that you can find between these two speeches. All right, so here's the escalation of Vietnam. So this is Ngo Dinh Diem. This is the guy we supported. This is President Eisenhower. Ngo Dinh Diem was actually a very controversial leader because he persecuted often the Buddhist minorities in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh is the guy who aligned himself with both Communist China and the USSR to gain support to reject the advances of the West. He considered any Western presence to be an example of imperialism. Things got very complicated when this picture surfaced in the United States. Is a Buddhist monk killing himself through self-immolation. The really confusing thing is he's actually killing himself to protest the South Vietnamese government. That's the government we backed. To make matters worse, we eventually let Ngo Dinh Diem be killed by a coup d'etat by his own military, and then the situation got further complicated. This is a South Vietnamese officer executing a Viet Cong soldier. This image surfaced in the United States too. And across the United States, people started to get very, very frustrated and confused as to what was going on. We were there to help stop the spread of communism and protect the South Vietnamese people. But if that was the case, why were people killing themselves to protest that government and carrying out executions like this? Of course, these are just pictures and they don't tell the entire story, but you can see why this war got very confusing to the American people. This is an example of the guerrilla tactics that the Viet Cong used. They used these underground chambers to fight against the Americans and that wanted to fight a conventional war. You can see why the Americans would struggle against this, because this is something that we were not used to, and some would argue were unable to adapt to. This is an example of the type of booby trap that the Vietnamese would use against American soldiers. This is called a punji stake trap. And inside these giant pits, they would put basically bamboo pikes, and sometimes they'd file them down and cover them up with human excrement. So if you did fall and didn't die immediately, you would usually get some pretty heinous diseases. So in 1965, we eventually abandoned Vietnam through Vietnamization. This is a famous example of South Vietnamese people who helped Americans trying to get off of the peninsula because they were afraid that the North Vietnamese would come in and kill them all, which in many cases did happen. Here's an example of Americans protesting the war. And this is the aftermath. This is an example of the killing fields in Cambodia. We're still not entirely sure how many people were killed by the communists there when they took over, but it's got to be in the millions, maybe a few million people that were killed during that terrible period afterwards. So just to summarize, the big takeaways here that in both Korea and Vietnam, some people turned to communism as a response to Western imperialism, which had been happening for over a century in Asia. The United States typically backed the southern portion in both of those countries and tried to make it so that the communists could not spread their influence there. That was in response to the domino theory. We were trying to contain communism. And for the Soviets and the Chinese, it was a chance to spread their influence and power as well. So the unfortunate part, of course, is that in both of these places, the natives became the real unwitting pawns between this big ideological conflict between these two sides. Okay? So just think about those couple things that I mentioned. Make sure you do the reading in the book. And then at the end of the notes, if you could just bullet a couple answers as to what similarities connect and separate these two things. Okay? And I'll catch up with you guys tomorrow in class and go over any questions you have before the quiz.